This is Josh Ellis at the Metropolitan Planning Council. Thank you for tuning in to today's event. This is part of a three-part series that the Metropolitan Planning Council is doing with our partners Elevate Energy and the Natural Resources Defense Council, called Water Resilience in Good Times and Bad. Today, our focus is going to be on water affordability in northeastern Illinois, what we know and what we don't know, as well as the ramifications of that, particularly in this period of COVID-19 for things like water shutoffs, water reconnections. We'll talk about what we know in Illinois. We'll hear some thoughts about the experience in some other Midwestern states, and then we'll have ample time for question and answer. At this point, I want to welcome my fellow speakers. Feel free to unmute your video. Caroline Packenham from Elevate Energy and Ann Evans from Elevate Energy. Caroline's going to present. Ann will jump in for some of the Q&A. There they are. And Jeremy Orr from the Natural Resources Defense Council, who's doing a lot of work here in Illinois, but also has substantial experience in Michigan, Ohio, and other Midwest and Great Lakes states, is going to share some of that perspective as we get into it today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker to get started, and our first speaker happens to be me. I'm going to share with you some research that the Metropolitan Planning Council, Elevate Energy, and NRDC, the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant conducted on water affordability, and talk about what we do and don't know. Before I do that, just to flag, this is the entire series, and you can see there at the bottom the date and time for next week's event about stormwater water quality issues. Tuesday, also at 3:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Hope you will join us. So as I get into my part of the presentation here, I just want to thank our partners in this, again, Elevate Energy and the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, and both Caroline and I will be sharing some thoughts today on the research. So here in northeastern Illinois, we know that water rates are on the rise. Here is some data showing escalating residential water rates in northeastern Illinois, and you can see them steadily increasing for the past 10, 12 years. There are a variety of reasons why water rates are increasing. A lot of the infrastructure in this part of the state, particularly in the city of Chicago, but not limited to the city of Chicago, is very old. The city of Chicago is currently replacing pipes that were installed while Theodore Roosevelt was president. I have a chunk of one of those pieces of pipes. It is made of wood. It is at my office. I'm not, or I would show it to you. So a lot of that infrastructure is past due for replacement or repair, and there are costs associated with that. We certainly have supply constraints in some parts of our region. Source water pollution, whether that be even in groundwater, radon, barium, things like that have to be replaced. So there's a reason that water rates are increasing. They've been increasing here, particularly in the last decade or so, after the city of Chicago increased its water rates. Many suburban communities that purchase water from Chicago or other communities that use water from Lake Michigan also in that moment increased their rates. And the ramifications of that are being felt today. At the same time that rates are increasing, we know that incomes are not increasing at the same rate, and that is what's bringing us to some of our problem today. So we did a study to really understand what do we and don't we know about water affordability in our region. How are utilities perhaps accounting for affordability in setting their rates? And that's what we're going to unpack today, along with some of the challenges in the ways in which we may or may not be accounting for affordability. Our study geography covered northeastern Illinois, which you can see here, 7 counties, 284 communities. The data that's available for those communities is water rates. The Illinois Indiana Sea Grant did a ton of work to try and identify water and wastewater rates for as many communities possible and developed a data set for 215. The color coding that you're seeing on the map speaks to the water source for that community. The light blue coloring that you see, those are communities that use Lake Michigan water. And then the different shades of brown and green are different combinations of groundwater, either deep groundwater, shallow groundwater. Some communities use a combination of groundwater and river water. There actually is a very wide variety once you get out of the Lake Michigan service area. And all of those different water sources come with their own sorts of issues that lead to escalating rates. If you're in the Lake Michigan service area, you're either pumping water from the lake if you're on the shore, or you're buying water from someone else, and there are costs associated with treatment, but there are also costs associated with buying water from someone else. And by the time water gets to, say, northern Will County, many of those communities have bought it from someone who bought it from someone who bought it from someone who bought it from Chicago or Hammond, Indiana, or Evanston, and there are cost increases that come with that. So what we did was to look at the best methodologies that we know of for determining water affordability. And I will tell you, best here should probably be in quotes because as we unpack it, you'll see that they're not great. We want to identify where in northeastern Illinois water affordability may be a concern. And the intent in doing this was to start discussions with utilities about how best to address affordability, which we have done. We're talking with Chicago, we're talking with Evanston about how to address affordability in those communities. So we looked at affordability a couple of ways. The first is the way that many communities look at affordability, and this is to say, looking at the households in that community who are at the annual median income. So they're looking at the median income earner. Is that household paying more than 4.5% of its income for water and wastewater expenditures? If yes, then a burden is said to exist, and if not, it's said that the water is affordable. That is a measure that is used by a lot of folks. Our contention with that is that by looking at the median incomes, you may be masking what is happening with folks who are making much less than the median. So we also looked at the burden being faced by folks in that lowest earning quintile. So in that lowest 20% of earners in a particular community, what can we see about their ability to meet their water and wastewater costs at 4.5% of income or less? I should just note here, the 4.5% is not some magic set in stone number. There are folks who think that should be higher, folks that think that should be lower. We used it for this assessment because it's what gets used. The notion that water rates are increasing is one thing. We also then wanted to look at income issues. And so we created this water affordability matrix to be able, with a higher degree of perhaps sensitivity, to look at communities that had either high percentages of households earning below 80% of the area median income, or percent of households in the lowest quintile, really trying to look at what the very nature of those communities was. We also looked at number of hours worked to pay a water bill, and Caroline will explain that a little bit later. This is a sort of a unique and new method of looking at it, and perhaps more intuitive, just to say how many hours do you need to work in order to pay the bill in that community. And then we created a dashboard for outreach, which is available on our website. The reasons we chose some of these methods, by using the income quintiles, as I've said before, you get to see what's happening for folks in a community at the lowest end of the income spectrum. We also looked at census tracts instead of municipalities. By looking at that municipal level, you can mask what may be going on in smaller geographies. By looking at things like water rates, the hours worked and the ability to pay water rates, that may be a more intuitive notion for a lot of folks than just looking at this percentage of total income. And by looking at incomes and the rate at which they are or are not increasing in communities in comparison to the water rates, it really helped us get a sense of whether there's a growing burden in these communities. So that's all the setup. Let's get into some of the findings. So when we looked at water burden, again, this is looking at census tracts within communities. When we look only at municipalities with at least one census tract who is highly burdened, so folks in that tract are struggling to pay at this 4.5% threshold if they're earning the median income, it tells this story. it suggests that only in a handful of communities in northeastern Illinois are we likely to see pockets, specific census tracts, where people are struggling to pay for their water and wastewater. If you just look at it this way, it suggests that perhaps water affordability is not that big an issue. But again, this is looking at the experience of that median household income. By looking at the lowest earning quintile and whether they're able to afford this 4.5 threshold, you get a very, very different map of the region. And what this suggests to us is that throughout northeastern Illinois, in Lake Michigan service communities, in groundwater communities, in river water communities, you have at least one census tract where a high water burden exists for that lowest quintile of earners. And you see it in places where I don't think there's a narrative about people struggling to pay their bills. Throughout DuPage County, into Kane County, in Will, even in Lake County, in the northern part of Cook County. This is not the normal story that we hear about south or west side struggling to pay. This suggests that in fact, throughout the entire region, in communities, including all the way up into McHenry, there are folks struggling to pay their bills. That either could be because the rates are high, or because incomes are low, or a combination of the both. When we did this comparison, so again, this goes back to that map. When you look at the lowest income quintile threshold, that map that you saw on the right, you're seeing the sheer number of high burden tracts throughout the region. By doing this assessment, we identified that there are 682 census tracts throughout northeastern Illinois where a high water burden exists. Versus if you look at just that median household income threshold, you see 4. And so this disparity between what the data, by looking at the median versus looking at the lowest income, is huge here for that. You see that a very small percentage of tracts are high burdened with that median household income threshold versus 37% of tracts where this high burden exists. And in 109 municipalities, and again, we looked at 280 plus municipalities for this, so 109 is a very high percentage. And we only had data for 215 communities or so, so more than half of those communities are facing this burden. Again, a much more widespread issue than perhaps has been previously reported. This water matrix burden of comparing incomes to water rates and then coding communities by whether a low to high burden exists also again suggests, where you see the darker blue, that this water burden as a comparison of income to rates exists well beyond the city of Chicago, out into McHenry County, down into Will County, throughout DuPage. It is not just limited to Chicago and a couple of inner ring Cook County suburbs. I'm going to ask Caroline to jump on and talk about the hours worked analysis. Again, perhaps a more intuitive way of thinking about the burden faced by households.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Josh. So yeah, we looked at how many hours a household would actually need to work in order to pay their monthly water and wastewater bill. And we ended up adapting this method from Dr. Manny Teodoro out of Texas A&M. And it's exactly what Josh said. We did this because it's just a really useful and illustrative way to think about water affordability in a community. And to conduct this analysis, what we did is we started by looking at the annual income in an income earning quintile. And we did look at the lowest earning income quintile. And then what we did is we converted that to an hourly wage. And then from there, you're able to figure out how many hours someone in an income earning quintile would need to work in order to pay their monthly water bill. And what we found is that 72 municipalities in northeastern Illinois, particularly households in that lowest earning income quintile, they would have to work more than 8 hours a month to pay their combined water and sewer costs. So I think that's just a really interesting data point for us to think about as we think about water affordability in our region. If we go ahead and flip to this next slide, as Josh mentioned, we also created this interactive online water affordability dashboard, which I really encourage you all to look up after today's webinar. But what it does is it gives you some of the findings of a research study, and you can actually look at it for each community, so all 215 communities. And then it shows some of our research findings alongside community characteristics and cost of living data. And so the slide that you see here, this is actually kind of the main landing page when you go into the dashboard. But what you're going to see here is you can select community, you can see income, housing, transit, and water costs for your community, along with race and ethnicity data and the number of households in a community, as well as renters and owners of homes. And then another really interesting feature of the dashboard, you can actually see the percent change over the past decade for income and water bill growth. And then you can also see that hours worked analysis that we just discussed for different income earning quintiles. And so if you want to go ahead and explore that dashboard, you just go to metroplanning.org/water dashboard. And with that, I will pass it back to Josh.
Caroline, and we'll put that link in the one that's coming up here soon in the chat so folks can explore that as well. So in addition to assessing these challenges with affordability, we also then wanted to start talking about solutions. And the challenge here is that not all communities are the same. Not only are their water sources different, but their infrastructure issues are different, their labor costs are different, and their incomes and their revenue generating ability are different. If you have a very heavily residential population versus a population that has a heavy share of industry or commerce, these just affect how you can generate revenue and what that means. So in the report, which I'll show the web link to here in a second, we have recommendations for actions that all communities could take, such as doing this assessment to look at what the experience is of that lowest earning quintile. We have recommendations for communities who have just higher water costs, communities that are facing an overarching low income issue, whether their costs are high or not, and communities with large, hard to reach populations, whether that's an older population, an immigrant population, whatever that might be. Communities that need to reach out to folks to talk about billing, conservation efforts, relief programs that may exist. So there are recommendations according to this typology for all of those communities. What that could mean is reassessing your rates instead of having a flat rate, so it's the same for everyone, you could have an increasing block rate where the first 50 gallons or 100 gallons of water a day are pretty cheap so that people get what they need to live at a very low rate. And then after that, it gets more expensive. There are lots and lots of different options, and the report speaks to those options here. So the full report that everything I've been describing, Caroline, is this Water Affordability in Northeastern Illinois report that we released earlier this year. It was supported by the Joyce Foundation and the Mott Foundation. Thank you to them. And you can find it at metroplanning.org/water affordability, and we'll share that in the chat window. The point in sharing all of this is to simply suggest there are folks throughout Northeastern Illinois, and really throughout all of Illinois, who are struggling to afford their water and wastewater costs, and that condition is probably much more pervasive than we really understand. In the last couple of years, there have been some great starts at media coverage about this. The Chicago Tribune had a great series called The Water Drain that I would encourage you to look at. It explored issues in Maywood and Fort Heights and a couple of other communities where the rates are high and incomes are generally very low. Just recently, Cranes had a series as well where the similar issues were explored. I think getting to why the rates are so high or why individuals or households are struggling to pay those bills needs some analysis at the utility level. And again, that's why we did this, to sort of unpack additional other options for how we might look at affordability in some of these communities. The ramification, if you can't pay your bill and if you get behind, conceivably, is that your water gets shut off, which is not good for that household, and it's not good for the utility as a whole, and particularly is not very good right now when folks are staying at home and need water for hygiene. So I'm going to turn it over to Caroline now to talk about what we know and don't know about water shutoffs and reconnections. Take it away, Caroline.
Great. Thanks so much, Josh. So yeah, for this next part of the conversation, what we're going to do is explore the scope of the problem in regards to water access, talk about what we don't know in regards to water shutoffs and reconnections, and then kind of end with some initial thoughts on how we can really begin to address water access challenges moving forward. So if we flip to that next slide. Thanks, Josh. So I do want to start by talking a little bit about the scope of water access challenges in the United States, just to kind of ground our conversation. And back in 2019, an organization called the U.S. Water Alliance and Dig Deep, they released a study on water and sanitation access challenges in our country. And what they found, they actually looked specifically at the number of people in our country who lack access to indoor plumbing. And they found that more than 2 million people in the US lack access to hot and cold running water, a sink, a shower, or a toilet. And what they also found is that race is most strongly associated with lack of access to water. And then they also found that economic status is another really strong predictor. And they pointed out in their study that water access challenges exist in wealthier communities. So I think that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind. And then they're also seeing that some states in our country, they're actually seeing increases in the number of people who lack access to indoor plumbing. So this is just kind of to ground our conversation today. If we move to the next slide, as Josh mentioned earlier, lack of access to water, it presents some pretty serious public health concerns. And this is true prior to COVID-19, but it's especially dire right now that we're in a pandemic. So really these water access challenges are very pronounced during current times. And so in response to these concerns, hundreds of utilities in our country and more than a dozen states have actually suspended water disconnections. In Illinois, the Illinois Commerce Commission, they also issued an order to suspend water shutoffs due to non-payment, but I would flag that they can only enforce this for private water utilities. We also saw in the city of Chicago back in 2019 that they did issue a moratorium on new water shutoffs. And so in early April of this year, the Illinois section of the American Water Works Association, what they did is they surveyed water utilities in Illinois to really learn more about water shutoffs and reconnections as part of a broader COVID-19 survey for water utilities. And what this survey found is that of the water utilities that AWWA surveyed in our state, all reported that they do plan to abide by the shutoff order that the ICC issued, but 56% of those surveyed currently have plans to reconnect water service to their customers. So I did just want to flag that as well in terms of reconnections. 56% of those water utilities are reporting plans to reconnect their customers to water service. So if we flip to this next slide, so what we're seeing is that we are seeing many water utilities halting disconnections during COVID-19, but many residents, they still do lack access to water, especially if their water was shut off prior to this order or local moratorium. And so to address some of these concerns, again, we're seeing some utilities reconnecting water service to residents. We're also seeing environmental advocates and nonprofit organizations really step up to the plate as well to launch emergency water access programs. Some of these water utilities are looking to reconnect water service. They are encountering challenges. One of the challenges that we're seeing is that a lot of utilities, not a lot, but some do have outdated data systems, and that can make it challenging to actually pinpoint and track who needs to have their water restored. Also, if you're seeing declining municipal budgets and revenues, that can also make it difficult to really invest in upgrades to data systems to address some of these challenges. And then even as some of these utilities and states are really taking the lead to reconnect water service, you're also seeing that some residents are fearful to report not having water access because of potential repercussions. So I really think we need to get a better understanding of who needs to have their water reconnected and really get a handle on this data challenge so that we can better manage this problem now and in the future. So that's just one of the problems that we're seeing right now with water reconnections. And if we flip to the next slide, kind of beyond the challenges associated with identifying who needs to have access to water reconnections, we're also seeing some health and safety concerns that really need to be taken into account when reconnecting water service. So it is important to have a professional on site when water is being reconnected to really ensure there aren't any leaks, any clogged fixtures in the home, and to really ensure that the wastewater piping is intact. So that's one concern when you're doing water reconnections. Also, if you've had that water shut off in a home for a while, there's also concern about buildup of heavy metals like lead and in bacteria in the water. So it is important to think about the water quality, testing, and then also ensuring homeowners are following appropriate flushing protocols. So really moving the water through the pipes before they drink their water again. And if you are connected to something like a lead service line, or if you have internal leaded plumbing, ensuring that a filter is being used as well. So if we flip to the next slide.
Caroline, we have like an immediate clarification question.
Yeah.
In Chicago, where we still have 200 to 300,000 non-metered residential properties, is there a significance or a relationship between understanding total amount of shutoffs given that population with uncertainty with no meters?
Yeah, I think, because there are non-meter customers, that does present, I think, an added layer and added challenge to figuring out who needs to have their water reconnected. Because if, an individual may have done the reconnection on their own, it just makes it more ambiguous as to who needs to have their water reconnected when you don't have all of your customers metered. Does that answer the question, Josh? Now, if we flip to the last slide. So that's just a little bit about what we know about water shutoffs and reconnections, including some of those challenges that are associated with the reconnections. I really do think it's critical that we all start thinking about how we can ensure residents have access to water, not just now, but in the future and after COVID-19. We're really seeing this real and dire need for immediate water access, reconnections, and then also short and long-term water affordability solutions. We need to think about how we can better track the problem so we can better manage it. And then we need to think about how we can help communities access funding to address these challenges moving forward, and what we really need to do to upgrade our water infrastructure to really promote public health. So I do definitely encourage you all to continue to ask questions during today's webinar. And on this last slide, you're always more than welcome to reach out to me at the contact information. My email address is right there. Be happy to chat with you one-on-one about water reconnections, affordability as well. So I'll pass it back to you, Josh.
Thanks so much, Caroline. So now Jeremy's going to jump in from the Natural Resources Defense Council to put Illinois in a broader context and talk about the experience in a few other states. I just want to follow up on Caroline's point. If you have questions, a few folks have already submitted them, which I appreciate. Please do that in the Q&A function and not in the chat function, as it makes it easier for us to track them if they're all in one place. And with that, I'll turn things over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Josh. Again, my name is Jeremy Orr. I'm a staff attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I work on our Safe Water Initiative, which really works to secure, safe, affordable, accessible water for all people, especially our most vulnerable populations. First slide. Thank you. So just to kind of put, Northeast Illinois in context, it's looking at it, especially in the, situation that we're living in now, and the crisis that we're living in now. I think it's safe to say that, what we're seeing has really exposed the disparities in access to a number of resources, but in particular access to water, safe, clean, affordable water. And we've seen those disparities really, take place along the lines of race and income, which is directly tied to, drinking water affordability. So just to give a little idea of, kind of where we are and throughout the region with Illinois, we can look at Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, and really, begin to have a conversation around whether or not their priorities show, the direction that they're going to go in, as it relates to water access and affordability following the crisis or post-crisis, and just, kind of looking at the steps taken. So as was mentioned, Illinois had submitted or issued an executive order for a moratorium on water shutoff and reconnections that unfortunately only applied to private private water suppliers. But there's survey was out that showed that many of our suppliers were still putting a moratorium on shutoffs and disconnections. And when we look at what's taking place elsewhere, you can kind of have a comparable idea. So just starting with Michigan, very similarly, an executive order was issued in which there was a moratorium on shutoffs and also mandating reconnections. And I think that's the important piece here, is the reconnection piece, right? So even in instances like in Chicago where there may be places that already have a moratorium on shutoffs that's been long-standing or even recent, we want to make sure that folks are getting out and actually reconnecting people to water. In particular, in Michigan, there was a Detroit executive order issued first, in which the state partnered with the city of Detroit to create a reconnection program and put a moratorium on shutoff. So that was kind of led at the city level before the state came, maybe a few weeks later to issue a statewide shutoff. The other thing Michigan did was took it a step further during the crisis and created a fund, a pot of money for local utilities, water utilities to say, okay, we need some support in getting these reconnections started. We need some support for this moratorium on water shutoffs that they can apply to, that comes with a number of stipulations, mainly reporting and transparency that are tied to it. And then turning our attention to Ohio, very similarly, they issued an executive order on shutoffs and reconnections. Most interesting, I think a lot of these moratoriums came around the same time, kind of mid to late March, and very similar. It was, Cleveland, first, issued their moratorium, and was then followed by the state, a few weeks later in issuing a statewide moratorium on water shutoffs and mandate reconnections as well. And one thing to note is very similar to Detroit. In Cleveland, there have been, this is a place where affordability has been a major issue, where shutoffs have been rampant for quite some time now, and there have been, many of legal challenges, existing and pending to keep people's water shut on. And then lastly, in terms of regional context, looking at Indiana, which has really kind of blown my mind over the last few weeks on how they've handled the crisis as it relates to water affordability. So there was again, an executive order issue. This one was a little weaker than the other states, somewhat even weaker than what we saw here in Illinois itself. And what made it weak was that it was pretty obscure in banning shutoffs and mandating reconnections, but in the language of the executive order itself, it specifically prioritized keeping businesses reconnected, right, in the language, right? So it was that public health and individuals and homes were kind of an afterthought. So the language, I think, this order particularly applies to businesses in the Hoosier state, I believe was the exact language. And I think and a big part of that is a bit confusing as well. But anyway, I was going to, so Indiana, American Water serves the biggest population of people in Indiana. I think it has over about 1.5 million people in their water system. And just last week, we got the notification that while Indiana is not shutting off water to people within that system, they just decided to increase rates by 5%, right? So in the midst of this crisis, they announced that they'll be increasing water rates by 5%. And that's no insignificant increase for any utility, but especially water during the crisis that's set to be implemented this year. And I think it goes back to what I mentioned at the very beginning, which is, how states are handling water right now in the midst of a crisis is pretty indicative of how it will be handled post-crisis. So when you think of places like Illinois and Michigan and even Ohio to some extent, in comparison to a place like Indiana within the region, you at least see an acknowledgement that access to safe, clean, affordable water is a priority, and kind of sets the stage for what potential work could be done to continue to fight for more affordable water. Next slide. And then looking at Northeast Illinois, I think there are, a number of issues that, a number of my colleagues have raised here on the webinar today, just, preceding, my presentation. It's been, clear, like water rates are, just a major issue within the region. I think when you look at the city of Chicago, water rates has, more than doubled over the past 10 years. And as Josh mentioned, that can be, related to a number of things, a number of reasons, whether, infrastructure and things of that sort. But the idea that, folks are paying, more than double now than what they were paying in 2010, it lets us know that we're kind of in the midst of facing a very real affordability crisis. And that's not just, here where we are, but it's also around the country. And I think the other thing where we struggle at is just disparities in safe drinking water enforcement. So as the data has shown, and NRDC did a really lengthy report, study and report on this that came out earlier this year, which is that low-income communities and communities of color are less likely to have, their Safe Drinking Water Act rights enforced. And I think that's directly tied to this issue of really, poor infrastructure. So when we're thinking of the most hardest hit communities are struggling with the ability to pay, and we know that utilities' primary source of income is coming from the rates. If I can't pay, I don't have the opportunity as a utility to collect those funds to upgrade the poor infrastructure that is, essentially at times poisoning residents. And I think it's a cycle that we really need to start tying together and figure out how do we break that cycle and tie together affordability with the physical infrastructure. Another major issue in Northeast Illinois is water loss and water waste. So water loss being water that the utility loses before it even makes it to your house, and then you have water waste, which is the water that you lose within your home due to your cracks in your plumbing, leaks in your plumbing. So if you have a meter, after it goes through your meter or if it comes into your home, it's lost before it comes out of your faucet. I think last year Chicago alone, or 2 years ago, Chicago alone lost 25 million gallons in water, which you got to think that equates to a very real dollar amount that the water utility is responsible for. The other thing is when you think of water waste, and I think Maywood was one of the places that Josh mentioned in terms of affordability. Them along with a few other kind of surrounding areas suffered a loss of in excess of $4 million just a couple years ago from water loss and water waste alone. So you think of a $4 million loss on a system that's already having difficulty collecting on their bills. It's a real issue that needs to be addressed, and it's an issue that impacts the resident as well as the utility companies, and there has to be a way to find solutions for these. And I think one of the other barriers that we face here in Northeast Illinois, but then everywhere, is just some of the legal and policy barriers, whether it be zoning, whether it be state law, local policies that deal with allowing water utilities to raise rates, or allowing water utilities to do what's necessary to secure the rates to do infrastructure projects, which would then make our communities healthier and safer. Next slide, please.
Sure, Jeremy, before we move on, could you go back to which utility or utilities in Indiana are raising their rates right now?
Yes, it's actually Indiana.
More about that.
Yep. Indiana American Water, which I mentioned serves about 1.5 million people. I think it's maybe the biggest water utility in the state. We saw last week that they'll be raising by about 5%.
Thank you.
But looking at the opportunities that we have as well in the state, and then especially within our region, there are a number of things that we can do to begin to tackle affordability on a large scale that extend beyond what we'd say is assistance, right? Low income assistance. But I'd say the first is there's a state law that was passed a couple of years ago that mandates that the state undertake a study on affordability and come up with a plan within the next couple of years to address affordability statewide. And I think that's a great opportunity to lift up what sort of affordability measures and rate structures and changes that we can make to get to the root of this problem. I think another big thing is as it relates to affordability access is just the moratorium on shutoffs, as we've seen with Chicago last year. Implemented a moratorium on shutoffs, which had it not, we can only imagine, we know that there are thousands of homes that are still disconnected right now during the crisis, but had they not stopped shutting homes off about a year ago, how much worse off, would we be? I think that's important. And I think the other thing is to recognize in the midst of, creating these moratoriums, be they permanent or indefinite, is they should coincide with some sort of affordability plan, right? Some sort of rate structure that ideally allows utilities to still collect some amount of money, right, to help maintain that system. With the moratorium for permanent shutoffs, really being reserved for the hardest hit communities and our most vulnerable communities, which leads us to this idea of exploring better rate structures or restructuring how we do rates, and in particular income rates, which have the opportunity to take into account how much somebody's making. So it's not just being charged for how much water you use, but how much can you afford so that you don't have to lose or limit access to water. I think we've really seen a growth in assistance programs. I know Chicago has a assistance program that rolled out this year to cover many residents that may fall under a certain threshold of income to help pay their water bill. And that goes with the established local funds, looking at ways that not only Chicago but other local governments in the area in our region can mirror those types of assistance programs to help folks pay their bills, so that in turn we can have the funding with our utilities to continue to do these infrastructure projects and make it more affordable. And I think just at the state level, just state and federal level, just broad investment in water infrastructure to drive down costs. I mean, local utilities and municipalities, they can't do it alone, right? As we know, we're strapped in the state, we're strapped in the city of Chicago, and there needs to be much more investment coming from the federal level in drinking water infrastructure, so that the funds we're spending, raising rates to replace expensive old crumbling infrastructure could then be used to make sure that water is accessible and affordable for all if we have some of those funds coming from the federal level. And just to close out, I think affordability, it's no surprise, it's a real crisis not only in our region but nationally. I think there are some really great opportunities coming out in the midst of this crisis and coming out of this crisis that has shown us that drinking water is it's a right, it's a priority, it's necessary and essential for our life and in public health. And I think now more than ever, water utilities and local municipalities are really recognizing that with what we're going through.
Thanks, Jeremy. Much appreciated. So at this point, we're going to segue to Q&A. So I invite all of our speakers to come back on, and we can quickly stop the slides. There we go. We have had a couple questions come in on the Q&A function, and we'll address those. Please do submit others there. One of the first questions was, how do you measure water loss? And I'm happy to tackle that one. Water loss, the question was, how do you measure water loss before the water gets to a user? So a utility generally knows how much water they have pumped out of their main processing system, and they know how much water they sold. Their meters can be inaccurate, but generally speaking, they know how much water they sold. And the difference between how much they pumped out and how much they sold is lost water. And there's two ways to lose water. You can physically lose it through a leaky pipe or a water main break or something like that, or you can lose it in a number sense, that you had a faulty meter on one end or the other, and the actual amount of water that was purchased doesn't match the amount of water that was used. So that's the two forms of water loss. And to Jeremy's point, we have communities in northeastern Illinois. Years ago, Berwyn was at 50% of its water that it was pumping out was being lost before it ended up on a bill. That was in the 80s or 90s. For the Lake Michigan communities in Illinois, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, who oversees the permitting for use of Lake Michigan water, asks but does not necessarily enforce that utilities keep their lost water to 8% or less of their total water. So again, it can be actual leaks and can be physical lost water, or it can be lost in a number sense, in that on one side or the other, the meters weren't working and the amount of water purchased didn't match the amount of water consumed. A question here for maybe Jeremy to tackle, or anybody else. Are utilities, water utilities, actually required to earmark a percentage of funds to improve infrastructure here or anywhere else? And if not, should they be? Should there be a designated percentage that should be going back into infrastructure upgrades? Jeremy, you want to tackle that first, and then I'd love to hear from Ann or Caroline.
Yeah, I can try to. I don't know the exact example or specific maybe policies or laws everywhere that deals with how much should be earmarked, and if so what it should be. But what I do know is a lot of places are expected, right, or sometimes by law expected to have a plan that deals with their long-term infrastructure. And I think what I found in some of my work really over the last few years is a lot of places are not in compliance with having that asset management plan, right? Or that they aren't required to have one. And that's where I think it gets difficult in how much money is being spent on infrastructure versus, rates or affordability or something else, because there is, in some places, there is no requirement to have a plan. So therefore it's difficult to then say, well, you still need to earmark X amount of money, for infrastructure when there's, no plan in place.
Ann or Caroline, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, as we think about the fact that we have a lot of smaller water utilities with limited staff and resources, what can we do to really support them with a lot of these asset management plans? So I think that's another piece to this is thinking about what support we can provide them to help make some of these upgrades as well.
Great. There's a couple questions here about the legality of different rate structures. Can you actually charge someone less if they have lower incomes, things like that? And then a question of, are there any actual examples of income-based rates other than the city of Philadelphia? Jeremy, I know your NRDC's done some work on the legality of income-based rate structures. Do you want to tackle that?
Yep, sure thing. And even, recently within, about 2 weeks ago, we came out with a legal report in partnership with NWF and the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center. And the whole purpose of the report was to go through the legality of creating an income-based rate structures in a space where, some ratepayers or municipalities may argue that, one set of residents, who make a higher income should not have to subsidize that of a lower income. And I think the thing that we came up with was for us an absolute, yes in Michigan, and we're starting to look into Illinois as well, where the laws that are in place that would normally, stop, taxes from being raised or tax dollars being spent or fees being spent on something that doesn't benefit the whole as opposed to an individual household. But our take on it and our legal work has looked at, exist, right? There are different rate classes, we'll say, already exist. Whether those classes are, in industrial or agricultural, residential, commercial, there's already a space in which somebody is paying more or subsidizing more for those who are paying less. And I think that is, for us, that's the crux of our argument. I think the other legal argument that's always made is it's seen as a tax, right? And what we've come to find is, the raising of rates is the raising of a fee, right? While people may want to equate it to tax, it just has a very different legal distinction between taxes and fees. And fees being raised, have a lot more fluidity to subsidize something like a rate class structure versus, your tax dollars being raised to subsidize that.
And do you know of any examples beyond the city of Philadelphia that are using it or that are exploring using it? Anybody?
Yeah, Baltimore is another major U.S. city that just passed that back in 2019. So that's another example we can look to.
Okay. There's a couple questions here about things specific to Chicago, how they are funding their assistance program. And then I would add on to that, because I know Elevate Energy is in the mix with all this. What do we know that the city of Chicago is currently doing or would like to do in terms of reconnecting people to water, even finding people whose water has been disconnected? Ann or Caroline, you want to tackle a little synopsis of what the city is currently doing in your role in assisting in all that?
Sure, I can jump in. I do not know what the source of funding is for the water utility assistance program. I know they started to pilot it. I think they believe the need is substantial and that they don't have sufficient resources out there for the whole city. So they're beginning to pilot it and make sure that they've got it functioning well, and then are going to be looking to expand it over time. But of course, I don't speak for them. They're also in the midst of trying to reconnect people. They are encouraging folks, if you or anyone you know is in need of reconnection, you can call 311 and get that process started. I do want to caution folks to acknowledge that it's a couple-week process. One of the challenges I think that water utilities face is oftentimes the water utility or the water department, water sewer department is one part of the process, and then the finance department is a separate part of it. And that's who you're dealing with regard to paying bills. So it's a kind of multi-step process.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions here from Peter Glick, who I assume is the Peter Glick, one of the nation's leading opiners on water issues. So I'm going to ask this, and don't screw up your answers. The question is, do we actually have good data on how much utilities lose in revenue from non-payment of bills? So if we have these programs and people cannot pay, is it clear how much of an issue it really is when there's non-payment? And what the actual costs of reconnection are. Does it cost more to reconnect people after you've shut them off than the money that you didn't collect in the rates? Anybody have a take on that?
Yeah, I can chime in. I can start and say yes and no to the data piece. I think we have enough data to see that a lot of a good amount of money is being lost. But I think one of the issues that we often leave off of affordability is transparency, right? So this idea that, everybody should be able to have access to this data, not just the utility, companies or municipalities, so that we can really see, how shutoffs and affordability issues are actually impacting communities directly, and not just kind of, take them at their word in the annual reports, that they give out where the data is kind of fudged oftentimes. So I'd say that, I think we could definitely be doing more in terms of receiving adequate, accessible data when it comes to the financial impacts that utilities purport to have.
I would just add with the other question, kind of the cost of water reconnections. I haven't looked at what that may cost when you think about all the different components that are involved in a water reconnection, but just thinking about what it would cost to have maybe a plumbing contractor come on site to make sure that you don't have leaks in your home if your water's been shut off for a while. That could be a couple $100 just through the conversations I've had with the plumbing contractors that we work with. And then if you think about, needing to do water quality testing, if you, need to install a filter, I think there are some costs that really layer on top of each other when you're looking at getting water reconnected for someone.
Yeah, I would to add that we don't have good data. So thank you for the question. I think that's one of the clear calls to action is to get good data and invest in data systems for water utilities that often don't have good systems themselves. And then I would just say, with regard to like how big of a problem it is, it's really going to vary by community. If you've got a community that's largely low income, there may not be enough revenue brought in to really support all the fixed costs of fixed and variable costs of providing water. Whereas if you've got a community that's either very mixed in its income or skewing high income, it's probably not such an issue.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to some of the findings from the research that we did, that particularly here in northeastern Illinois, and we're a little bit different than some other places in the country because the sheer number of water utilities we have, and many of them are very small, and many of them serve an almost uniformly poor population and an almost uniformly residential population with not much industry to generate revenue from, and not a lot of income diversity. And so the ability of those communities to do any of what we're talking about is extremely constrained, simply because they don't have a lot of revenue coming in. In order to get revenue, they have to raise rates on folks who have generally low incomes and can't afford it. And how we get out of that cycle is something we have not figured out, because the problem still exists. But I think it's increasingly apparent that we need to figure out what the future is for some of these communities who are stuck in this cycle of increasing rates and decreasing incomes. One of, I think Peter's other questions was, does anyone know of a national database of current shut-off moratoria or reconnection policies? I've seen Caroline shake her head. I don't know of one. I believe I got a link sent to me from maybe Food and Water Watch that they were trying to create one, but I'm not sure how comprehensive it is. Jeremy, do you know of a national database?
Yeah, I think that's the one I was going to refer to as Food and Water Watch. I know there are two more that I've been keeping up with, and they're specifically related, to the crisis where, we've been tracking it. I can find those and circle back, but Food and Water Watch, I think, is the most probably comprehensive one that I've been using.
If you could, Jeremy, if you find the link to that and just post it in the chat window so folks online can see it, and maybe post your the legal analysis of the income-based rates too in the chat so folks have that. One of the questions I think was a simple one back to our research. Were we looking at the 4.5% for both the median household income and the lowest quintile? And the answer is yes. So we looked at that, the ability to pay, to have water and wastewater costs at 4.5% of your income, whether you're at the medium or lowest in quintile. And again, that 4.5 is not a magic or some other number. It's just a number that was set. Some folks think it should be lower, some folks think it should be higher, but we use that 4.5 for that. I will say we've gotten several requests for more research along these lines, particular to northeastern Illinois. How much is this, the issue we're seeing with affordability has to do with water source? Is there a different story for the Lake Michigan communities versus the groundwater? We aggregated everybody together. We didn't pull it apart. I think if folks are interested in more lines of analysis, we'd be interested in doing that. Question coming in about an optimal method for communities to address equity while implementing conservation pricing to promote water conservation, and whether anybody knows of any particularly good models. I will say our partners, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, did an assessment a couple years ago trying to determine what water rates existed in the region, and found somewhere around 20 examples of increasing block rates. I think increasing block rates are held out as a potential to do both conservation and more equitable pricing. What we don't know is, while they have the ability to do that, are they actually being used for that? I don't know that we've done an analysis of those 20 water rate systems to determine what the experience of the lowest income earners in those communities is. But the premise is, for that base, 50 gallons or 100 gallons a day, that's enough to, flush the toilet 10 times, make some spaghetti, take a shower. You could have that water be fairly affordable, and then the water beyond that perhaps you're watering your lawn with, washing your car, things like that are definitely optional, that water starts to become more and more expensive. So the premise of that increasing block rate, I think, could work for conservation equity. I don't think we know whether it truly is, at least in the northeastern Illinois experience. And I think now that we have enough cases where communities are using increasing block rates, which is in itself new, it wasn't the case several years ago, we're going to do some analysis to figure out what the experience is of lowest income earners in those communities. Does anybody else have thoughts on this, balancing equity and conservation, particularly in areas where there are definite finite water constraints? All right, well, I hope that answered Scott's question. Here's a question from my boss, which I am contractually obligated to ask all of you. So many fiscal pressures can push family budgets into the danger zone. What do the panelists think about applying an income screen across the board for utilities, water bills, transit costs, electric, gas, with public resources making up the rest? Is this needed to close the wealth gap and bridge income disparities? Why limit this question of ability to pay for water? Shouldn't we be doing this across the board? Take on that. Ann, you want to jump in? You guys do a tremendous amount of work on energy issues.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Thank you, Mary Sue, for that question. At Elevate Energy, we believe everybody should have healthy, safe, affordable ways to heat, power, and water their homes. So we are working to advance solutions that combine efficiency and conservation with good rate structures that save people money while allowing them to have comfortable, healthy, safe, affordable homes. And we really think it's an integrated approach that's needed. So I also appreciate your question, because we're not, it's really all the utilities that matter when we're talking about affordable housing. It's not just rent, it's not just mortgage payments, it's those electricity costs, those natural gas costs, and those water costs. And I think there's a lot of work being done right now to advocate for larger utility assistance programs. So it's great to see the city beginning to provide water assistance, but it really needs to be done in combination with the electric and gas utility assistance programs. We'd like to see those be broadened and easier to apply for, so that if you're already qualified for some income-based program, be it healthcare, be it emergency food assistance, SNAP, TANF, there's lots of program acronyms. Couldn't you already be qualified and opted into some of these programs? I think the thing that we've already knew is that most people living in this country are about $600 away from really running into big financial trouble if they lose income unexpectedly, or if they lose, if their expenses go up unexpectedly because of an unexpected health issue or whatever it may be. And I think that the utility assistance programs can be used to help people manage through the volatility of that regular ongoing challenge, but also that's really exposed right now, where people are really suffering from a loss of income. So I think there's a lot that can be done there.
Thanks, Ann. Jeremy or Caroline, anything you want to add in on?
No, I would just echo Ann's point. I really liked how she brought up the fact that what can we do to kind of streamline some of these programs and kind of maybe make it even one application. So if someone's getting, assistance from a natural gas or an electric utility, what can we do to kind of streamline these services to make it a lot easier for residents? The other thing that I think is really important in all of these conversations that we're having, we really need to start having more conversations too, I think, with residents to learn what would be helpful for them and what they would value and what would make it easier to gain access to these programs. So I think that's something that I'd really, as we're having some of these one-on-one conversations with water utilities, that I'd really like to fold into the mix.
Yeah. Great. While Ann was responding, her colleague, Ann, a different Ann, posted in the chat a link to a report from the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, who I hear have awesome parties, that has tracking information about water rates, electric, gas, and other utilities. So that's in the chat window. And then Jeremy posted the link to the Food and Water Watch, which again are maybe the most comprehensive assessments of what is currently going on in terms of connection or shutoff moratorium. Question that came in, to the extent that anybody can comment on Any of the federal legislation that we're seeing. Someone heard that the Senate Environment and Public Works bill that just passed this week includes some policies on affordability. Anybody have any thoughts on any of the federal legislation that we're seeing if you're tracking it?
This probably isn't quite answering the question, but we have been tracking the first CARES bill that included an increase in LIHEAP dollars and where those dollars are going in the Great Lakes region, and making sure that the states are set up to help the dollars get out the door. I think one of the things that is really worrisome is that given that we're all working from home, it's much more difficult to apply for the Low-Income Heating and Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, which can also be made available to help pay water bills. There is some flexibility at the state level, but it's set up to be an in-person enrollment experience, and the community action agencies are really doing an awesome job to try to pivot very quickly to be able to take enrollments online. But that's one of the things that's on our radar. But I don't think that was really responsive to the question. So,
Jeremy, yeah, you have a take on any of that federal legislation?
I did. I saw earlier today the House introduced their next, kind of round of COVID, support, and the things that stood out to me among everything else was just how they're attempting to address water in its current form. I think one of the, I think they were maybe 3 or 4 things. So I think it had 1.5 billion for a low-income household drinking water assistance program, which would be new. It was mandating the creation of a low-income assistance program specifically for water. And it also, if I'm not mistaken, it also allowed for LIHEAP funds to be used for water assistance during this time. And I think just the fact that they're even thinking about it, right? The fact that it showed up in the bill that was introduced, I think is a great step in the right direction, and hopefully something that does stick as we try to address water affordability longer term.
Yeah, I saw the House bill come across too. I think that's great. I think here in Illinois, we're lucky to have folks like Congressman Quigley, who's been working on this. The question about the Senate Environment and Public Works bill, we're also lucky to have Senator Duckworth on that committee, and to Tim, who asked the question, I will track down the answer to the extent to which it addresses water affordability and make sure you get that answer. We only have one other question that's come in on the chat function, and then I have a question back to everybody before we wrap up. I think this question is, are there opportunities to work with municipalities to address water safety and access issues? With the Flint example, we see how hard it is to address water safety, access, and equity all at the same time. So I can speak a little bit to the work that Metropolitan Planning Council is doing, some work that we're doing with Elevate Energy, and then open it up to talk about this. So I will say the Metropolitan Planning Council, as an outgrowth of something called Drinking Water 123, which is a guidebook that we wrote a couple of years ago for local elected officials. Like essentially no one, at least here, maybe in more water-stressed areas of the country, this actually happens. To my knowledge, no one runs for mayor on a water agenda in northeastern Illinois, and they get elected, and then, hey, you run a water utility now. So the guidebook that we wrote, Drinking Water 123, is a primer for folks who are now in that position of running a water utility. And we can share the link to that as well. It's questions to ask your public works director, questions to ask your finance director, how to get your feet under you as a public official running a water utility. As an outgrowth of that, we invited proposals from communities for local technical assistance projects. And so this year, even with everything going on with COVID-19, we're getting projects off the ground in the village of Hazelcrest, which is a South suburban community. They're looking to do a full lead service line replacement plan, and we're partnering with the Center for Neighborhood Technology on that one. CNT has developed a way to quickly scan handwritten building permits as a way to try and identify whether a lead pipe may or may not exist in that property without having to go dig anything up. We're working in Sauk Village on a water loss audit. Again, going back to that question of how do you know you've lost water and how much. Working with Robbins on a project to just establish some priorities for future capital improvements and other water related issues. And then working with Elevate Energy in Evanston and perhaps Chicago too soon to really look at the water rate situations there. And Caroline can jump in here and talk about those projects. But I mean, I think the short answer to the question is yes, there are opportunities to work with municipalities on these issues. The question is, how do we get resources to do that? CMAP, our partners at CMAP, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, also have a local technical assistance program, and they provide some support on water issues too. One of the things we're actually trying to do right now is get additional resources from the Illinois EPA for groups like CMAP or the Rural Water Assistance Program to provide more technical assistance to local units of government. We have loan programs like the state revolving funds, which exist to support low-income communities, but there are often real barriers to applying for those funds. And so we find that that money doesn't end up in the communities it was designed to support. So we're trying to address that. Caroline, you want to talk briefly about our work with Evanston and Chicago?
Yeah, I guess just kind of backing up, you know, Josh mentioned this earlier, but one of the goals of the study that we worked on with MPC and Illinois Indiana Sea Grant was really to kind of kickstart this conversation in our region on water affordability and how to tackle it. And so I was really heartened after we released that study and have presented to groups of utilities to actually have people proactively come up to us and express interest and actually digging into their community more and use real billing data to really figure out the challenges they have with water affordability in their community. And so as a result of this research that we've done, we're working with two communities right now to really conduct a more in-depth water affordability analysis. So with the study that we previously conducted, we used water rates and estimated usage for the community, but the communities we're working with right now, they're willing to share data with us to really help us analyze the scale and scope of the problem, and then to really craft tailored solutions for the community, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It can be different, you know, what's going on in Chicago versus Evanston versus Robbins versus Harvey. So you really do need to look at the community level to kind of tailor some of these solutions. So yes, we're really excited to be working one-on-one on some of these water affordability analyses and then to propose some tailored solutions for those communities.
Great. So final question for everyone before we wrap up. Literally like 3 hours before this call, our groups plus the Illinois Environmental Council and several others sent a memo to Governor Pritzker requesting a whole bunch of things related to water issues, many of which have been spoken to right now. Specific question for Jeremy and then one for Caroline and Ann. Jeremy, in that memo to the governor were requests about what happens after the moratorium, what happens with late payments. This is something MPC's been looking at a lot for what happens after the rental eviction moratorium ends and how do you avoid an eviction cliff. Share your thoughts on how do we avoid a water shutoff cliff after a moratorium ends.
Yeah, I think the big thing it's going to take, and I think we talk about in our letter, is just really, a commitment from the state, right? I think it's going to take not only a commitment to say, hey, we're going to enact, legislation or executive order to maintain this, shut off either permanently or indefinitely till we come up with a better plan, but also financial investment, right? As I mentioned in the, in the Michigan work kind of earlier when I was presenting, it was, there was a pot of money created, right, to begin to make sure that utilities could continue to move in that direction and not have to go back to, shutting people off or running or getting them for arrears, right, or trying to collect these, fees that we know are waived as it exists, but may go back to that space. So I think the big thing is the state being able to provide some sort of financial support to help subsidize these issues as we figure out a plan to tackle it long term.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. And thanks for your collaboration on that memo. We'll share that memo once it's posted on our websites with everybody who called in today and on last week's and on next week's. Caroline and Ann, some of the recommendations in there were about ways to utilize water infrastructure writ large, whether it's supply issues or stormwater, as a stimulus opportunity to get people back to work. And I know a lot of what you guys do is employ people to do this kind of thing. What do you see as the opportunity here with water resources as part of stabilization and stimulus opportunities?
Well, one thing that just thinking about a water workforce and some of the infrastructure improvements that we need, just thinking about the city of Chicago, we have 390,000 lead service lines. How can we think about replacing those lines, but then also, creating the water workforce of the future and putting a ton of people to work to replace those lead service lines. And I think there's a whole bunch of other water infrastructure improvements and needs at our water utilities for jobs as well that we can really use to stimulate our economy and get people good jobs. So those are some of the initial projects that come to my mind when thinking about that question.
Thanks, Caroline. Ann?
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity for rebuilding our water infrastructure. We've spent a lot of time today talking about the need, which is ginormous in terms of a crumbling infrastructure, the need to replace lead service lines, the need for new and better technologies in people's homes so that we can detect leaks right away and and address them right away. And that all translates to jobs. I think the other emerging trend is a lot of our water workforce is reaching retirement age. And so I really see clean water jobs as an important new future good jobs that we should be investing in, particularly because we're a Great Lakes state, and it's such an important asset for our economy. And I just want to throw it out there as well that as climate refugees in the United States and around the world are needing to think about resettling someplace, the Midwest is a very attractive place to resettle. So getting it right and providing clean, safe, affordable water that promotes economic development and employs a diverse set of people from Illinois is really a huge opportunity that I hope the governor jumps on.
Thanks, Ann. And again, thank you all and to many other folks on the call today, including the Illinois Environmental Council, for partnering on that memo. So thank you all for speaking today. Thank you all for attending. I just want to leave you with a couple final thoughts. One, to the research that Caroline and I spoke about water affordability issues. We talked a lot about the city of Chicago, but again, those maps that we shared suggest this is an issue throughout northeastern Illinois. If the best thing that you can do if you want to learn more about how your water utility is or is not accounting for affordability issues, pick up the phone and call City Hall in whatever community you live with. Talk to the Public Works Department, talk to a public information officer, see what's going on, and drop us a line with what you learn. We would love to talk to you and to your community about how to account for affordability issues. We shared a variety of resources in the chat window. Thanks, Jeremy, for adding in a couple, as well as my colleague, Mandy, and of course the report from MPC, Elevate Energy, and the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. And I want to thank you all again for joining us today and wish you very well. Again, we will post all of these events to the site when we are done with them all, and appreciate you spending your time with us this afternoon. Thanks very much. Have a good day.